99% of primitive humankind was wiped out 900,000 years ago, long before cities ever existed. Imagine waking up one morning, 900,000 years in the past, only to realize that almost the entire human race had vanished, leaving behind just a few scattered groups, wandering in hunger, darkness, and fear. What truly happened to the 99% of early humans? And why are we, the survivors, still here today? At the darkest moment of humanity, when our species stood on the brink of extinction, picture the Earth around 900,000 years ago. The planet entered a period of extreme transformation. The global climate turned cold and unstable. Winters stretched endlessly, food sources dwindled, and once thriving forests withered into barren, cracked wastelands. Early humans, fragile and entirely dependent on nature, became victims of a life-or-death catastrophe. According to genetic studies, nearly 99% of the early human population was wiped out during this period. If there had been around 100,000 individuals, only a few hundred or a few thousand survived. A number so small that humanity itself teetered on the edge of disappearance. This event is known as a population bottleneck. Just like pouring water through the narrow neck of a bottle, most get stuck, only a few drops make it through. Humanity at that time was the same. Countless branches, species, and subspecies of early humans vanished forever. Only one fragile line remained, clinging to survival on Earth. This was not only a biological event, but also a cultural and existential disaster. Before it, Earth was home to scattered groups of early humans across Africa, the Middle East, and even into Eurasia. They had primitive languages, simple stone tools, and in some places the first sparks of fire. But after the catastrophe, much of what they had built was erased from history's map. Which raises the question, why are we, those listening to this story now, the descendants of the few who survived? To answer, scientists look deep into our DNA. Inside every cell, every human genome carries a strange mark. A sudden collapse of genetic diversity around 900,000 years ago. Instead of hundreds of rich genetic lineages, everything narrowed down, as though humanity was reborn from a single small group. It means this, had that group also disappeared, there would be no one left to tell the story of humanity today. In the next part, we will delve deeper into what truly caused this near-extinction event. Was it because the Earth itself grew harsher, or did a natural catastrophe sweep away nearly all of our ancestors? When the Earth became humanity's enemy, to understand why almost all early humans vanished, we must look back at the climate of 900,000 years ago. That was the time when the Ice Age cycles grew more violent than ever. Dense forests, once full of fruits, roots, and small animals, gradually disappeared, replaced by cold, dry grasslands. Terrifyingly, this change did not unfold over a few years or even generations, but stretched across tens of thousands of years. For a species without agriculture, without the ability to store food, and entirely dependent on nature, this was a death sentence. Groups of early humans began to compete for scarce resources. As animal herds migrated farther away and wild fruits ran out, they were forced to wander endlessly in search of food. The farther they went, the more often they encountered other desperate groups like themselves. Instead of cooperation, survival often demanded conflict. Battles broke out not out of ambition, but simply for hunting grounds or a small water source. Meanwhile, the cold made the fragile ability to keep fire alive even harder. Imagine a band of early humans huddled around a fire, but at any moment, rain or strong wind could snuff it out. With no matches, no lighters, rekindling a fire was a monumental challenge. Losing fire meant losing light, warmth, and the ability to cook food. In the suffocating darkness, predators lurking nearby were even more terrifying than the cold itself. From a scientific perspective, DNA is like a living diary. Genetic studies show that the population collapse was so severe that the entire globe may have been reduced to around 1,000 surviving individuals, a number smaller than a single modern village. If, at that moment, a plague, a natural disaster, or a massive volcanic eruption had struck, humanity might have been erased entirely. So why did a small group survive? Perhaps they found a refuge with a milder climate, where water and food were still available. Perhaps they had better tools for hunting or digging up roots. And perhaps the spirit of cooperation, sharing fire, sharing food, protecting one another, was the decisive difference between those who survived and the many who vanished. It is clear that, in humanity's harshest trial, our survival instincts were pushed to the very edge. And perhaps that was the first soil where the seeds of human intelligence and resilience were sown. In Part 3, we will explore how these rare survivors sustained themselves and what legacy they left us, the ones who endured the darkness, to exist today. When most early humans disappeared, only a few remained. But they did not survive because they were stronger, but because they knew how to adapt in adversity. One of the most crucial factors was fire. Those who knew how to preserve fire had a chance to overcome the cold and the dark. Fire not only gave warmth, but also drove away predators, cooked food for easier digestion, and, most importantly, became a symbol of unity. Around the fire, humans began to tell stories, warn of dangers, and connect as a community. Next came stone tools. Sharp stone flakes, once used only to slice meat or crack bones for marrow, gradually became weapons that allowed humans to balance the struggle against nature. With tools, they could hunt larger animals, dig deeper into dry soil for roots, or defend themselves from enemies. Those crude stones became the weapons that allowed humanity to breathe through the ice. But the most astonishing factor was cooperation. In danger, only groups that stood together survived. Imagine a pack of wolves stalking in the night. Alone, death was almost certain. But when the group gathered, shouting, hurling stones, and keeping the fire blazing, the wolves withdrew. Collective strength saved humanity, while many larger, stronger species went extinct. This shows that the bottleneck 900,000 years ago was not only a catastrophe, but also a defining moment of human identity. In adversity, we learn to share, to rely on each other, and, more importantly, to awaken the first sense of community. Those survivors were our direct ancestors. Every person alive today carries the blood of those brave humans, the ones who endured the moment when humanity nearly vanished. Looking back, perhaps it was that near extinction that forged our endurance above all other species. At the end of Chapter 1, we can sum it up. Humanity today is the result of a survival miracle. Without that small group, there would be no story to tell, no civilization, no cities. In Chapter 2, we will explore the deeper hypotheses. Was it solely the ice ages, or was there another invisible enemy? The hidden cause of near extinction, harsh climate, the silent killer. To explain why humankind once stood on the brink of annihilation, scientists begin with the Earth's climate 900,000 years ago, a period of some of the most violent environmental changes in history. The planet had entered a prolonged glacial cycle. Massive ice sheets at the poles advanced, swallowing land and lowering sea levels. Cold, arid conditions spread across the globe. Dense forests, the home and primary food source of early humans, gradually disappeared, giving way to poor, dry grasslands. For large animals, the main source of protein, this was also catastrophic. Many species migrated far away or went extinct. Humans lost one of their rarest sources of nutrition. Meanwhile, edible plants became scarce. Hunger was no longer a temporary state, but a crisis lasting tens of thousands of years. Geological evidence shows rainfall dropped sharply, and many rivers and lakes dried up. For early humans, losing water meant death was imminent. Even once rich hunting grounds turned into cold deserts, where no life could endure for long. Crucially, early humans had no means of food storage, nor any long-term migration strategies. They lived from day to day. When nature turned its back, communities collapsed rapidly. Any group unable to adapt in time vanished forever. Some researchers suggest that during this era, humans were forced to change strategy. Instead of relying solely on gathering, they learned to hunt in an organized way. Instead of dispersing, they began to cluster more tightly together. Thus, climate adversity became a driving force for both intellectual and social evolution. However, climate alone may not be the full explanation. If cold and drought were the only factors, many other species should have disappeared as well. Yet some survived. So what made humans uniquely vulnerable? This leads to the next hypothesis. Supervolcanoes or sudden natural disasters may have delivered the final blow. Volcanoes, natural disasters, and the death trap. Beyond prolonged glaciation, another compelling hypothesis is supervolcanic eruptions. The Earth's changes were not always slow and gradual. At times, it was shaken by sudden, devastating events. When a supervolcano erupts, trillions of tons of ash are hurled into the atmosphere. This ash blocks sunlight, causing global temperatures to plummet, an event known as a volcanic winter. Under already harsh conditions, when sunlight was cut off, plants could not photosynthesize, vegetation died en masse, and animals followed, along with humans. Early groups had no capacity to store food for years. A single prolonged volcanic winter could erase an entire community. Geological evidence suggests there were indeed major eruptions in Africa and Eurasia around 900,000 years ago. While no single event has yet been pinpointed to align exactly with humanity's genetic bottleneck, the hypothesis remains persuasive. Humanity was struck down precisely when it was most fragile. Alongside volcanoes, another possibility is ancient pandemics. We often think of epidemics as problems of dense societies, but even in nature, bacteria and viruses spread swiftly. For early humans lacking any knowledge of medicine, a new disease could wipe out an entire group in just weeks. Because they lived in small, scattered bands that often migrated, outbreaks would have been nearly impossible to contain. On top of this came localized disasters. Extreme droughts, floods, earthquakes, storms. Today, we have technology to forecast and respond. Early humans were utterly defenseless. A single prolonged drought could doom multiple groups to extinction. Taken together, ice ages, droughts, volcanoes, diseases. Humanity did not face a single enemy, but a relentless series of blows. They were driven to the brink, exhausted, and ultimately only a few managed to endure. The remarkable fact is that, in desperation, those who survived learned to act differently. They did not merely cling to life. They began to develop creativity, communication, and cooperation to overcome the crisis. Perhaps this was the turning point that allowed humans to eventually surpass all other species. Why only one line survived? The greatest question remains, when nearly every branch of early humans disappeared, why did one lineage escape extinction? Scientists believe that habitat played a crucial role. Most likely, the surviving group found a refuge with a milder climate, where water and minimal food sources still remained. Some studies suggest East Africa, the cradle of humankind, as the place where they endured the darkest period. Lake valleys, where animals gathered, may have served as survival strongholds. But location was only part of the story. More important was adaptation. Instead of wandering aimlessly, this group may have developed more effective hunting, foraging strategies. Tracking animals, using more refined tools to exploit scarce resources, and maximizing every available scrap of food. Another decisive factor may have been social cooperation. While many groups collapsed under conflict and hunger, the survivors likely held together more strongly. Sharing fire, sharing food, protecting the young and the elderly. This was a critical shift. Unity became a survival weapon stronger than brute strength. Another crucial element was primitive language. We do not know whether they spoke in words or only with sounds and gestures. But clearly, they had a more effective means of communication. Warning of predators, coordinating hunts, and sharing knowledge about food. This ability gave them an edge over less cohesive groups. Astonishingly, from this tiny band of survivors, all modern humanity arose. Genetic studies show that we all carry the imprint of that severe bottleneck. In other words, today's 8 billion people are descendants of just a few hundred, or at most a few thousand, individuals who held on 900,000 years ago. This highlights both the fragility and the miracle of our existence. Had that group been less cohesive, less resourceful, or struck by one more calamity, the story of humankind would have ended long ago. The bottleneck was not merely a disaster, but a decisive turning point in our future, for only those who were resilient, intelligent, and cooperative survived. They laid the foundation for humanity's later ascent. The survivors at the edge of extinction. After the nightmare of near extinction, a small group of humans remained. But their survival was not a random miracle. It was the result of endurance, creativity, and unity. qualities that would later define humanity itself. Imagine being one of them, wandering across a cold, barren land. Before you stretches a desert of lifelessness. Behind you lies the memory of vanished groups, their bones bleaching on the ground. Death was everywhere, and it was in that moment that humans were forced to change in order to live. The first difference: flexibility in finding food. When fruits and roots were scarce, they turned to hunting small animals. Rabbits, rodents, birds, fish. They used every part of the carcass. Marrow rich in nutrients, hides and fur for warmth. Nothing was wasted because every bite of meat, every drop of fat marked the boundary between life and death. Next was mobility. They did not remain in one place. They followed herds, traced rivers, and crossed valleys in search of water and food. This migratory habit would later enable humans to expand their range, leave Africa, and gradually spread across the world. Above all was the spirit of community. The injured were not abandoned, the whole group cared for them. Children belonged not just to parents but to the community because every life was precious, every pair of hands necessary. In hunts they cooperated. Some drove prey, others ambushed, others struck. When they ate, they shared. Though rations were meager, sharing meant the group retained hope. Many researchers believe that this era planted the seeds of morality and the first sense of social responsibility. For only by valuing one another and standing together against nature could humans hope to survive. And there was one special weapon: imagination. Humans began to remember paths, plan hunts, even predict what might happen. The ability to see the future in the mind was a leap no other species possessed. It allowed our ancestors not only to flee danger, but to create strategies for survival. In short, these survivors were no longer just primates wielding tools. They had become beings capable of thought, cooperation, and hope. And from them, all of humanity today was born. In the next section, we will examine in detail the weapons of survival: fire, tools, and primitive language, the things that helped humans endure the darkness for hundreds of thousands of years. Weapons of survival: fire, tools, and proto-language. In harsh conditions, our ancestors lacked the claws of lions, the fangs of leopards, or the speed of gazelles. But they possessed a unique weapon: a creative mind. It was this that turned a small group into the only beings able to survive in a brutal world. The first was fire. Archaeological evidence shows that around 800,000 to 900,000 years ago, humans had learned to control it. They might not always have been able to make fire, but they knew how to keep it, carrying embers from natural wildfires, sustaining flames for days. To keep fire was to keep light, warmth, and safety. With fire, they cooked food, making it easier to digest and absorb more energy. This was a turning point. A high-energy diet became fuel for brain growth. Next came stone tools. At first sharp flakes, gradually refined for cutting, chopping, pounding, and digging. A simple hand axe, seemingly crude, could split bones for marrow, chop wood for shelter, or even serve as a weapon. Stone tools were proof of abstract thinking, selecting raw materials, improving designs, and passing skills down generations. But perhaps most crucial was proto-language. We do not know how they spoke, but certainly they developed systems of sounds and gestures to communicate. Language allowed them to share information, warn of danger, and coordinate hunts. More importantly, it became the foundation for transmitting survival knowledge. How to keep fire alive, where to find roots, how to set traps, how to read the weather. Language also unlocked collective imagination. A group could envision a plan together. We surround the herd from this side and drive them toward that cliff. No other species could do this. Combining fire, tools, and language, humans possessed the most powerful arsenal. Not claws or fangs, but intelligence and cohesion. From that moment, humans were no longer merely fragile creatures. They had begun their journey toward dominance. In the next section, we will see how these survivors laid the foundation for a great leap forward. From survival instinct to the leap of intelligence. From a handful of survivors, humanity planted the first seeds of a very different future. What made them special was not just endurance, but the ability to turn adversity into opportunity. First, Scarcity forced constant innovation. When food was rare, they diversified diets. Digging roots, catching fish, trapping birds, exploiting every source of nutrition. When crude tools no longer sufficed, they sharpened them, shaped them for specific purposes. Each small invention, accumulated over generations, paved the way for an intellectual leap. Second, community spirit was etched into instinct. In a harsh environment, no one survived alone. Organized hunts, sharing fire, protecting one another, these did more than keep people alive. They sowed the values of future society. Trust, responsibility, compassion. Human morality sprouted here. Third, memory and knowledge transmission. To find a hidden water source, they had to remember it and teach their descendants. To invent a new trap, they had to retell it, repeat it, improve it. Early culture took root, not through writing but through stories, actions, and customs. Most importantly, humans began to imagine the future. They asked, where will we hunt tomorrow? What will the next season bring? What lies beyond that horizon? The ability to picture and plan was an evolutionary breakthrough, turning fragile creatures into beings capable of shaping destiny. From a few hundred, or at most a few thousand survivors, they multiplied and passed on an invisible legacy. Creativity, community, memory, imagination. The four pillars that propelled humankind toward world domination. In the following part, we will see how these seeds led to territorial expansion, branching lineages, and eventually the dawn of civilization. Evolution after the crisis, expansion beyond Africa. After passing through the bottleneck, the survivors not only recovered but began to expand. From hundreds to thousands, they grew in number and inevitably sought new lands. Africa was their cradle, but it was also limited. Climate shifts made food unreliable. To survive, they had to migrate. Rivers dried, grasslands appeared and vanished, pushing humans to leave familiar ground for new horizons. Archaeological evidence shows that some hominin lineages left Africa as early as 1.8 million years ago, though most vanished. But after the bottleneck 900,000 years ago, a new wave emerged, and this time it shaped the future of humanity. They followed coastlines rich in fish and shellfish, river valleys that provided water and safe passage, and open plains along migrating herds. Imagine small groups carrying stone tools, cradling embers of fire, taking the first steps out of Africa. Each step meant lurking danger, predators, strange climates, unknown lands. Yet also declared, humans would not surrender. On their journeys, they encountered other human species such as Homo erectus and the precursors of Neanderthals. Sometimes they competed, sometimes they interbred. These encounters diversified the gene pool and honed adaptability. Strikingly, though their numbers were tiny, humans gradually spread across Eurasia. They thrived in tropical forests, African savannas, even European ice sheets, more flexible than any other species. This expansion was not merely migration. It was the beginning of humankind's conquest of the planet. Those hesitant first steps out of Africa paved the way for humans to inhabit every corner of Earth. From the Amazon to the Sahara, from the Arctic to the distant islands of the Pacific. Next, we will explore how these branching lineages, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens, emerged, and why only one ultimately inherited the Earth. The human lineages, the strong, the weak, and the vanished. As survivors expanded, they were not alone. The Earth was like an evolutionary stage, where multiple human species coexisted, each with its own story. Some thrived, some faded, and in the end only one endured. First was Homo erectus, the upright human, one of the oldest and most successful, lasting nearly 2 million years. They used sophisticated tools, controlled fire, and spread across Eurasia. They were pioneers out of Africa, yet they eventually disappeared, perhaps unable to adapt quickly enough or outcompete. Next came the Neanderthals, dominant in Europe and Western Asia. Stocky and robust, built for the Ice Age. Skilled hunters, tool users, and perhaps with spiritual lives, burying their dead, using pigments for decoration. Yet they vanished around 40,000 years ago, partly due to competition with Homo sapiens, partly due to climate shifts. Farther east were the Denisovans, a mysterious lineage known mostly from DNA in bones. Few fossils remain, but their genes live on in modern humans of Asia and Oceania, evidence of interbreeding that granted sapiens crucial adaptations. At the center was Homo sapiens, wise humans, smaller than Neanderthals, weaker than predators, yet far more intelligent. Sapiens created diverse tools, organized hunts, and most importantly built cohesive communities through language and imagination. They could cooperate with hundreds, even thousands, of strangers thanks to shared beliefs. Ultimately, as other lineages faded, only Homo sapiens endured and spread. But it is vital to remember, modern humans were not alone at first. We once shared the earth with many cousins, competing, interbreeding, and learning from them. These interactions shaped not only our DNA but also our culture and identity today. In the next part, we will ask, what allowed Homo sapiens not merely to survive, but to rise above all others, to become the ultimate conquerors of the planet? Why Homo sapiens became the ultimate conqueror. In the survival race among human lineages, Homo sapiens were neither the strongest nor the most uniform. But they alone could transform imagination into collective power, and that was the key to defeating every rival. The first difference: flexible cooperation. Neanderthals hunted well, but only in small groups of dozens. Sapiens could unite hundreds of strangers through language and shared beliefs. A painted handprint, a story of a forest spirit, or an animal soul could bind entire communities. This enabled large-scale hunts, defense of territories, and even exchanges between groups. The second, relentless innovation. Their tools did not stop at crude stone but became refined into barbed spears and sharp blades. They also wove memory into art, cave paintings, bone and shell ornaments. These show they sought not only survival but meaning. More importantly, sapiens excelled in learning and transmitting knowledge. Discoveries did not vanish with individuals but lived on in collective memory. When one group found a faster way to start fire or a more effective trap, that knowledge was preserved and spread. This was cultural evolution, faster and more powerful than biological evolution. Third, sapiens adapted with extraordinary flexibility. They lived in rainforests, savannas, icy mountains, and even crossed seas to remote islands. No other human lineage thrived in such diversity. Thus, when climate shifts struck, others perished but sapiens endured. Together, flexible cooperation, relentless innovation, collective memory, and adaptive versatility. These gave Homo sapiens unmatched advantage. Gradually, they did not just survive, they dominated. They interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, yet in the end only one lineage remained: us. From this foundation, sapiens opened a new chapter, not only survival but civilization. From stone to metal, from caves to villages, then cities. And it all began with the small band who survived the catastrophe 900,000 years ago. In Chapter 5, we will witness the Great Transition. How Homo sapiens moved from nomadic hunters and gatherers to farmers and herders, laying the foundations of the first cities. From survival instinct to the first civilizations. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived as hunters and gatherers, moving with herds and seasonal fruits. This flexible lifestyle fit a changing environment. But as communities grew, hunting and gathering could no longer sustain them. Population increased, fertile land grew scarce. Groups had to share territory, compete for food. Each winter or drought turned hunting into a gamble, and humans did not always win. This pressure opened a new path. Instead of depending on nature, humans began to control it. At first, perhaps, they simply replanted seeds near camps. Seeing them sprout, they gradually realized they could create food. A monumental discovery, not by accident, but through observation, experiment, and teaching across millennia. At the same time came animal domestication. Wolves that lingered for scraps became hunting partners. Later goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs provided meat, milk, hides, and labor. Domestication turned humans from wandering hunters into producers. It transformed not just diets but worldviews. They no longer lived only for today, but planned seasons ahead. They settled, built sturdier shelters, and formed villages, the nuclei of society. Though agriculture carried risks, crop failures, disease, land conflicts, the stability of food outweighed them. This was a turning point. From nomadic wandering to settled life, planting the first seeds of civilization. Villages, the first community hubs. With farming and herding, people no longer roamed endlessly. They built small settlements near rivers, grasslands, and fertile soil. At first huts of wood, earth, and grass. Later proper villages, embryos of organized society. In villages, people lived together long-term, dividing labor. Some hunted, some farmed, some crafted tools. This division made villages efficient and deeply cohesive. Villages also became centers of knowledge. Farming techniques, seed preservation, domestication skills, all transmitted through generations, never lost but accumulated. Here lay a critical difference. Humans evolved through culture and knowledge, not only genes. Living densely, they needed rules and shared beliefs. Who could hunt where, who kept seeds, who kept fire. Early religions emerged. Gods of rain, thunder, earth, binding communities and explaining the world. Villages not only sustained life, but fostered creativity. Murals, clay figurines, rituals. When basic needs were met, humans dreamed, created, and searched for meaning. But new challenges arose. Disputes over fertile land and water sparked conflicts. Humans needed leaders, stricter rules, and complex organization. From villages and agriculture, the foundations of cities were laid. The first cities. As populations grew and farming yielded surpluses, humans produced more food than they consumed. Surplus changed everything. Not everyone needed to farm. Some specialized in tools, trade, construction, or governance. Division of labor enabled cities. Uruk in Mesopotamia was one of the first, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, vast compared to any village before. Walls for defense, temples for gods, bustling markets. In Uruk, cuneiform writing emerged to record harvests, trade, and laws. Not only Mesopotamia, Memphis in Egypt, Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, early centers in China. Wherever they arose, the pattern was the same. Cities became hubs of economy, politics, and culture. Cities transformed life. From tightly knit hunter-gatherer groups, humans now lived in stratified societies. Farmers, artisans, merchants, soldiers, priests, rulers. Laws enforced order, laying the groundwork for states. Between power and labor, cities also nurtured ideas. Ziggurats reached skyward as expressions of aspiration. Canals and dams showed human mastery of rivers. Cities created collective memory, where history began to be written and stories, laws, and knowledge preserved for posterity. The cost was high. Diseases in dense populations, wars between early states, deep inequalities. Yet humanity did not return to nomadism. Once cities arose, human history had entered the era of civilization. From the shadows of forests to the lights of cities, humankind had endured a perilous yet hopeful journey. What makes us different is not only standing upright or wielding tools, but our ability to dream, to build, to seek meaning. We are here today thanks to small yet enduring sparks. A sharpened stone, an ember kept through the night, a story passed down. Together, they became the great river called civilization. And the question remains, on this long journey, what will you leave behind? If you want to continue exploring the epic story of human evolution and survival, subscribe to the channel for the next episodes. Share in the comments what resonated with you most, and don't forget to share this video so more people can look back at our extraordinary journey. For in the end, we are not only products of 7 million years of evolution, we are the ones still writing the human story.